We started a series last week about the prophets, and I want to continue going into a bit more detail. Tonight, we're going to look at Amos, and we're going to look at an overview of the book, so lots of detail that will be left out, but one of the things that we find right at the beginning of the book is a mention of an earthquake, and so we're going to just have a quick look at that as we go through this. But this prophecy is leading up to something big that God is going to do, or actually maybe several big things. But Amos is perhaps the earliest of these major or minor prophets that we have. Joel might be before him, but I don't really know where Joel fits in, so we're just going to take Amos for tonight. And so he's leading up to the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom of Israel. So he's before they are actually taken into captivity. And so he's prophesying about that. But in the very first verse of Amos, it says, "The words of Amos, who was among the sheep breeders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake." Now, when we talk about the earthquake, we don't have a record of that in the books of Kings or Chronicles. We don't read about that earthquake happening, but it says that this was 2 years before it and that it was during the days of Uzziah. And in Zechariah 14 verse 5, it also mentions an earthquake that happened during the days of Uzziah and that the people fled from that. It was apparently a very big event that people remembered for a long time afterwards, for generations afterwards. And earthquakes, they're not unknown in Israel. They're not that uncommon. The land of Israel is on a fault line under the ground where earthquakes happen. So it is a territory where earthquakes do happen, but this one that he's referring to is something that was much larger than normal. And there was a study done by some geologists who looked at archaeology, I believe, from the time period of Uzziah. And they saw evidence of a very large earthquake during that time. They wrote an article in the International Geology Review, which I believe is a fairly reputable scientific journal. So it's not just some people making this up, but they believe that there was evidence of what seems to be the largest earthquake that land has seen, that they know about, that they've seen any evidence for, that happened around the time, at least within 100 years or so of the time of Uzziah. They can't really be more accurate than that in looking at the evidence, but it seems to fit what this is saying, that during that time there was a very large earthquake that happened in the land, and it would have caused a lot of damage. And when you look at the beginning of the book of Amos, he's looking at all the kingdoms in this territory, all of these different ones. He starts off with Damascus, which is Syria or Edom. Then he talks about Gaza, which represents the Philistines. He talks about Tyre, so that's Phoenicia. He talks about Edom and Ammon and Moab and Judah, before finally talking about Israel and spending most of the prophecy talking to Israel and what's going to happen to it. But he doesn't say that much about what's going to happen in particular to these other nations in the book of Amos. There's a couple of them where he says he's going to cause a fire to break out and consume these nations and their cities. But I wonder a little bit. He doesn't say it specifically, but because he mentions that earthquake, this huge earthquake, it's going to affect all of these nations because this is not that big of a territory. They had a few years ago, or maybe even last year, there was a big earthquake in Syria, and in northern Israel it was felt. It didn't do much damage, but they were expecting a big earthquake to happen in Israel after that. I don't think it ever did, but they were thinking that they were probably going to have one before too long. And maybe they still will. I don't know. But there is that fault line that runs through this territory, and so a really big earthquake would probably affect a lot of these, perhaps all of these different countries, if that's what God wanted it to do. And so this idea of the earthquake coming may be part of the judgment that was coming on these nations. Not all of it. We find in other prophets more detailed prophecy about all of these and about how they were going to be taken out by the Babylonians or others, and that did eventually happen. So I think that's all part of the prophecy as well. But I believe this earthquake that was coming was probably part of the judgment that he announces against them. I want to look for a moment at the reasons for the judgment on these other nations. There's not a lot said about the other nations because Israel is the focus of Amos's prophecy. But before he gets to them, he talks about all the surrounding nations, and he gives a reason for judgment against them. When you talk about Damascus, which was the capital of Syria, it says they threshed Gilead with implements of iron. Gilead was part of Israel. And the idea of threshing them, that's like whipping. It's what you would do to grain to break it up. But this is talking about what they did to the people, to the people of Gilead, that they were cruel to them, they were crushing them. And it was not something God was pleased with. When you talk about Gaza, which is one of the major cities of Philistia, it says they delivered a whole captivity to Edom, the idea of enslaving a whole group of people. Young, old, didn't matter. They delivered all of them over to Edom. Tyre did the same thing. It says, Tyre delivered a whole captivity to Edom and did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. And then he talks about Edom itself and says, Edom pursued his brother with a sword and cast off all pity. Remember, Edom was the nation that came from Esau. So when it talks about his brother, Esau's brother is Jacob or Israel. So this is talking about what Edom did to Israel. It says he pursued his brother with a sword and cast off all pity. So when all of these other things were happening, and I don't know exactly what he's referring to, because this is before Israel is taken into captivity. But some bad things have already been happening to Israel or to Judah, and Edom has no pity for them. His anger tore perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever, it says. He was just always angry at Israel. He hated them. This nation hated Israel. And God did not like that at all. That was not what he expected from these nations that were even related to each other. When he talks about Ammon, he says they ripped open the women with child in Gilead that they might enlarge their territory. Ammon was right next to Gilead on the east side of the Jordan River. And so they were doing this just to enlarge their territory. They wanted more land. And so they were not just even fighting against the soldiers, but they were being very, very cruel to the Israelites in how they were dealing with them to get them out of that land so they could have their land. God did not appreciate that at all. With Moab, it says they burned the bones of the king of Edom to lime. We don't have any record of that in the history books in Kings or Chronicles, but apparently that's what happened. And Edom, at one point at least, was under Israel, or under Judah, the control of Judah. And we know, like in the time of Jehoshaphat, Israel and Judah and Edom all went up against Moab because the king of Edom was under the king of Judah at that time. But so it probably, when it talks about them burning the king of Edom, the bones of the king of Edom, to lime, it was something that was done as an insult to Edom, but also to Israel, because they were under Israel. But that's a little bit of guesswork, because we don't know exactly when this happened, why it happened, or any of that. But it was not done out of love or any good motive, and God was not at all happy with it. So he was going to punish Moab. But he was also going to punish Judah. He said they had despised the law of the Lord, did not keep his commandments. He says their lies lead them astray, lies which their fathers followed. So they were following after lies rather than after the law of the Lord. They were despising the law of the Lord, saying, no, that's not what's right. Our fathers taught us something different. And so God says, yeah, your fathers taught you lies, and I'm going to punish you for following those lies instead of following my law. But then he turns his attention to Israel, and most of the book is focused on Israel. And so these are some of the reasons, at least. I may have missed some, but that he says he was going to judge Israel. He says they sell the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of sandals. And this is a very common theme in the reasoning here. They were not taking care of the poor. They were oppressing the poor. They didn't care for the righteous. Those were their enemies. The righteous were not like the leaders. The leaders were unrighteous, so they hated the righteous. And if they could get something out of them, they would do it. If they could sell them for silver, they would do that. They didn't care about the poor. They'd sell the poor for a pair of sandals. It was just, people were worthless to them. They just had no love for anyone. There was also sexual sin that was going on in the country. He says, a man and his father go into the same girl to defile God's holy name. And this seems to be also perhaps related to their idolatry. Fornication was very often part of idolatry. But they say they lie down by every altar on clothes taken in pledge. That may just be relaxing, lying down. But they're saying what they're lying down on, not a big blanket or something like that. They're lying down on clothes that they had taken in pledge from the poor. When they loaned them some money, they took their clothes in pledge. And the law of Moses said if you take their clothes in pledge, you have to return it to them that night. That's not what they were doing. They were keeping them and using them as blankets to lie down on by their altars. And drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. They would take this wine away from people who were being condemned to death and enjoying that in the house of their idols. They were not concerned for people. They were just concerned for what they could get. They were greedy and uncaring. And he says that, God gave them prophets and Nazarites, but they gave Nazarites wine to drink, which was against God's law. And Nazarites were not allowed to drink wine. But the people were trying to force them to drink wine. And the prophets, they told them not to prophesy. We don't want you to prophesy. And we see that even in the book of Amos itself. He is told not to prophesy. And so this is something they were doing, and God hated it. They were not caring about God and holiness and listening to what God has to say. They're basically telling God to be quiet. We don't want to hear what you have to say. And we don't want these people to be holy to you. And they were oppressing the poor and crushing the needy, turning justice to wormwood, which is the idea of bitterness or poison. It would turn water into something people couldn't drink. And they were laying righteousness to rest in the earth. In other words, killing it. They were killing righteousness. Justice meant nothing to them. They didn't care what was right or wrong. They cared about what they could get, what in their greed. And it says they hate the one who rebukes in the gate and abhor the one who speaks uprightly. They did not appreciate being corrected. They just hated those people who were telling them they were doing wrong. And God hated that. He was going to bring judgment on them because they were doing wrong and they would not listen when someone rebuked them for it. It says they tread down the poor and would take grain taxes from him, forcing him to give up food, even though he can't afford that. They were afflicting the just and taking bribes, diverting the poor from justice at the gate. If you couldn't pay to get the judges to rule in your favor, then you would lose. If you were poor, you could not get justice because they were looking for bribes. The leaders and the wealthy lived in luxury, and they were not grieving for the affliction of Joseph, which I believe is talking about the common people of Israel. They didn't care what was going on with them. They were focused on living a very luxurious life and comfort, and they didn't care what happened to anybody else. They wanted the feast days and the Sabbath to be finished. They'd ask, when will it end? So we can go back to making money and cheating people so that they can sell the poor again. And they swear by the sin of Samaria, the golden calves, is what that's talking about. And so they were swearing by the god of Bethel and Dan, and God hated that. And so those are some of the reasons, at least, that God was going to judge Israel and bring this destruction upon them. But while Amos is prophesying all of this, he has some opposition that comes up. Amaziah was a priest of Bethel, so he was one of the priests of the golden calves. And it says that he wrote a letter to King Jeroboam, and that's Jeroboam the second, not the first one who made the golden calves. This is much later. But he wrote to King Jeroboam that Amos has conspired against you in the midst of the house of Israel. And he said that he was prophesying that Jeroboam would die by the sword and Israel would be led captive from their own land. Now, this is very similar to the false accusations against Stephen that we read about in Acts chapters 6 and 7, because it's very close to what he's saying, but it's still false testimony. It's not accurate. Amos never prophesied that Jeroboam would die by the sword. He prophesied against the house of Jeroboam, not that Jeroboam himself would be killed. He was prophesying that Israel would go into captivity, but he didn't say it was during the time of Jeroboam. It was going to be soon after. Amaziah then told Amos to go to Judah to prophesy, rather than prophesying at Bethel, because it belonged to the king, which apparently means it didn't belong to God, right? Don't prophesy here because this is the king's place. But every place belongs to God, doesn't it? But Amaziah, even though he was a priest, he didn't actually care about truth. He was serving the king, not God in any way. And so he told Amos to go to Judah to prophesy, but we do not see Amos listening to that. In fact, he responds in verses 14 through 17. It says, Then Amos answered and said to Amaziah, I was no prophet, nor was I a son of a prophet, but I was a sheep breeder and a tender of sycamore fruit. Then the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. Now therefore hear the word of the Lord. You say, Do not prophesy against Israel, and do not spout against the house of Isaac. Therefore thus says the Lord, Your wife shall be a harlot in the city. Your sons and daughters shall fall by the sword. Your land shall be divided by survey line. You shall die in a defiled land, and Israel shall surely be led away captive from his own land. So Amos didn't back down. He was not intimidated. He just said what God told him to say. He says, I'm not a professional prophet like they think of as of the prophets. They're not doing it for pay. They're not doing this for what they can get out of it. Amos was prophesying because God told him to. He was just a common worker, a tender of the flock, a tender of sycamore fruit. He was just a common laborer. He wasn't some professional prophet. He just told people what God said. But the end of the book leaves us with hope for the future, which is very common in these prophets. And God prophesies doom against his people, against Israel. But even after all of this doom and gloom, God ends the prophecy with hope. It says that he would raise up the tabernacle of David, which had fallen down. And this is while the temple was still standing. It would still be standing for quite a while longer. But in this prophecy, it says it has already fallen down. So the tabernacle of David is not the physical temple that he's talking about. He's talking about a place of worship like David had, like David's people, those who really worship God, who are after God's own heart. That would be raised up again. And Israel would possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by the name of the Lord. And this prophecy is quoted by James in Acts 15, when he was showing that the Gentiles could be part of the kingdom of Christ without becoming Jews. It says Gentiles would be called by the name of the Lord. And so this is a prophecy of the church, not of the physical Israel. But it is still a message of hope. God would bring back the captives, they would have success, and nobody would ever remove them from their land again. Well, that was not fulfilled with physical Israel, because they were certainly removed from their land again. But it is a prophecy of the church. It is a prophecy of the spiritual Israel. And it is still a message of hope for all those who care about the plan of the Lord and true salvation that he would bring. So, in conclusion, God hates injustice. That's one of the main messages of this book. For if you look at the what he was going to judge the surrounding nations for, much of it was the way they treated other people. It was unjust. And of course, with Israel, that was one of the main focuses, how they treated the poor and the righteous. A nation that is corrupt is a nation that will fall. You can't remain corrupt forever and just pervert justice forever and think that you're going to remain a strong nation. It cannot happen. And a people who oppress the poor is a people that God will punish. And I don't believe that's necessarily just at a national level. We've looked recently at some of the parables that talk about this idea of taking care of the poor, the rich man and Lazarus, which is not a parable, but some of those stories in our studies of the parables have that idea. And so one of the things we didn't specifically look at here, but you can notice as you read through the book, is that these were still very religious people. They still made sacrifices. They liked their own way of worship, which God hated, but they were very religious. But those who are religious without practicing truth and justice are worse than those who do not know God at all. He doesn't talk about the Moabites and and the Ammonites and the Edomites as these people who were horrible people because of the way that they worshiped or the way that they dealt with their own people even. But he says, he spends his time focusing on Israel, and he says, you were a special people. You were different from everybody else, and that's why I'm going to judge you for how you're behaving here. When we know the truth and we don't practice it, it's worse than even those that don't know God at all. We need to make sure that we're part of the tabernacle of David that has been rebuilt by Christ. We've got to make sure we're living a life of dedication to Christ in all things, which includes a concern for the needy, which we see in this prophecy. I'm not saying that's the most important thing in our service to Christ, but it is important. We see it in the New Testament. We see it here in the Old Testament. God cares how we treat those who are poor and needy. But we can have a wonderful and secure life in Christ in the kingdom that he restored. And there's no one who can remove us from that if we will follow our King and really do things his way, walk in justice and care for others, and make sure we're following Christ according to his law. Don't despise his law, but listen to what he has to say. All right, that's a bit of a summary of the book of Amos. I hope that was helpful for you. Thank you.